We are back on the Zero Hour. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and joining us now is the prominent economist Dean Baker, here to help us make sense of a couple stories in the news in the past week or so. As always, Dean, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot for having me on.
Listen, my first question for you has to do with CEO pay. The FCC recently published its rules, I guess 5 years later, but they published them on disclosure of CEO pay ratios to those of other workers in the corporations. Two-part question for you, I guess. First part is, were those rules adequate in your opinion? And second part, based on a commentary you wrote recently, what more needs to be done to get CEO pay in line? But first, you think those rules were decent?
Well, they correspond to what was in the bill. You know, there's some technical issues, how exactly you define employees, this and that. But, you know, they basically get the story. So, you know, we're going to learn what the ratio is of, you know, the CEO's pay to the pay of a typical worker. And, you know, that was what I presumed the bill was asking for. So in that sense, I don't think there's major complaints on that, you know, the differences between the various ways in which you could have interpreted that would have led to relatively small differences in what the measure ends up being. So I have no particular complaints about that.
And now, to the point, I guess the purpose of the bill's provision here was so that the public had a greater understanding of wealth inequality and how profit within corporations is being distributed among the various parties who contribute to it. And I guess the second part is you wrote a piece saying that corporate directors were the real culprits in CEO pay. Could you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we've seen this explosion in CEO pay, and the question is, why is that happening? And you know, the logic, I mean, you like to think we have a market economy, so you're going, okay, so why is these people are suddenly getting outlandish pay? And, you know, if you ask the CEOs, they go, well, that's because we're worth a lot of money. And you go, well, fine, we all like to think we're worth a lot of money, but, you know, the question is this really a market relationship? And the reality is you go, okay, well, how is your pay determined? You have boards of directors, and these boards of directors often largely owe their jobs to the CEOs. And it's a very, very cushy job. A lot of people don't realize, you know, don't have much understanding of the corporate governance structure that, you know, you have boards, typically, you know, 10, 12 people. It could be a little smaller, it could be a little larger. They're largely self-perpetuating, but how does someone get picked to be a director? Very often the CEO and other top management play a direct role in selecting people. So you're sitting there, you get paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for coming to, you know, sometimes as few as 4 meetings, rarely more than 10. And, you know, you have an incredible incentive just to go along. So, you know, the CEO goes, hey, I'm getting $15 million. You know, someone else down the street's getting 20. I should get 20 also. And in principle, the directors are supposed to represent the shareholders, and they're supposed to look at the CEO the same way the CEO looks at their assembly line workers. You know, we can get someone cheaper in China. But if you're a director, do you think anyone ever says to the CEO, you know, we could get someone cheaper who's going to do as good a job as you from Europe, from Japan, from China? I'm willing to bet that never happens. But that is what's supposed to happen. But if you're sitting there on a board and, you know, you're going, God, you know, we have a CEO and they're really not particularly good. Why are they getting $15 million? You know, you have CEOs that are very competent. And I'm just talking about making money for the company. I'm not talking about being good people. Right. Making money for the company. Very competent, run profitable, you know, companies in France and in Germany, and they get $2, $3, $4 million. I mean, it's a lot of money, but it's nothing like what our CEOs get. So you would like to think the directors are going, why are we paying you $15 million? You don't seem to be doing a particularly good job. How about we give you $3 million? You don't like it? Go look for another job. Never happens, or I should say almost never happens. So I'd say the problem here is really the structure of incentives, that the directors have very little reason, very little incentive ever to do the job that they're supposed to do, which is to try to hold down CEO pay as much as possible.
Well, and I can tell you from my own corporate life that I went to a few director dinners. They were always lavish events where there was a lot of socializing with the CEO and senior management, not a lot with the rest of the workforce. So doesn't that get to issues of the selection of of board directors. That there's theoretically in a publicly traded corporation, those directors are representing the shareholders, but that doesn't seem to play out much in practice, does it?
No, and that's exactly the point. Again, I like to keep hitting on this because people talk about market relationships. Well, we have rules of corporate governance. I mean, those don't come from God. Those were, put in law. A lot of them are at the state level, some at the federal level. For example, this rule about CO ratios, that obviously federal, but many of the rules on corporate governance are set by the state. And they're very elaborate. I mean, you can't just run a company any way you want. You have all sorts of disclosures you have to make. There's a lot of rules. A lot of them are about protecting minority shareholders, so you can't get 50.1% of the stock and then tell the other 49.9% we've expropriated your shares. You could say that though. I mean, if we believed in total free market, why shouldn't companies be able to do that? And if you're worried that could happen, don't buy stock in it. We could do that, but we don't. We set elaborate rules of corporate governance, and one of those rules, those rules could be structured to ensure that shareholders really do get more of a say. Now, my particular proposal, I have no idea if this is the best, surely not the only way, but my particular proposal on, how you can give directors some serious incentive to try to put a check on CEO pay is to take advantage of another provision that was in Dodd-Frank. Again, the financial reform bill passed back in 2010. It requires that shareholders get a regular vote on the compensation package of their CEO. And it's just up or down. It's just, do you approve, disapprove? And it's purely advisory. So, it's, the consequence of having one voted down, it's a bit of an embarrassment. Very few are voted down. It's less than 3%. But nothing happens. No one gets fired. The pay doesn't get cut. It's just, like a slap on the wrist for, the CEO and, presumably for the directors who approve the pay package. But what I suggested was suppose we actually put a little muscle behind that. Suppose we said, okay, you're a director. You approved a CEO pay package. Your shareholders turned it down. Guess what? You lose your stipend. You thought you were going to get $200,000 or $300,000 this year for coming to 6 meetings. Guess what? You lost that. So maybe you should think more carefully next time. Is this what we have to pay our CEO? Maybe we can get away with paying them less. Maybe you should think about that more carefully. So you want to keep your stipend. Anyhow, I mean, I think that's the sort of thing. And again, this is a question of getting the incentives right, getting the structure right. And we clearly don't have that now. I mean, you wouldn't be seeing CEOs, and again, you could understand, not necessarily disagree with it, but you have someone like a Steve Jobs, clearly a brilliant person, a great innovator, maybe deserved the money. You could argue that. I mean, but that's not, 99% of CEOs. 99% of CEOs are just there running the company as bureaucrats. If they grab the next person in line, they probably do the same or better job. Very hard-pressed to say why these people should be getting 15, 20, 30 million. Carly Fiorina, the woman who's running for president in the Republican primaries, I could say the woman because she's the only one. She was CEO of Hewlett-Packard. She walked away with $160 million. Her reign was a disaster. Their stock price fell by 20%. They laid off, I think it was something like 20 or 30,000 workers. I mean, it was not good by any measure. She walked away with an enormous amount of money. You go, how does that work?
Right. Right. And of course, what keeps coming to mind, we're talking with economist Dean Baker about CEO pay and compensation. I keep coming back to the banks and the horrific performance of the banks during the last decade in the run-up to the crisis, and the fact that there seemed to be such a glaring disconnect between CEO pay and performance there. And by the way, it makes me wonder, I don't know your thoughts about this, Dean, but it makes me wonder whether there shouldn't also be some sort of governance rule that says if your institution commits or people within it commit X number of criminal actions within a year, that there are penalties or consequences for directors and executives.
Well, including the issue of criminal actions, I think very interesting, very important one. I personally am not that thrilled with the idea of going after corporations on criminal actions. I have to say I'm a little bit at a loss in understanding the logic. And let me just be clear on this. I think people should be punished, but the point is people should be punished. I literally don't understand the logic, and I'll be as concrete as I can. A lot of the cases that came out of the financial crisis, these had to do with them, issuing bad mortgages or passing on bad mortgages. In many cases, the settlements, were 5, 6, 7 years after the fact. That was true of Bank of America, many of the others, probably just about all of them, in fact. So you go, okay, so who exactly are we punishing? So here you had people in 2004, 5, 6 who were knowingly passing along or issuing fraudulent mortgages, or the case of, was it Moody's? I think that was the credit rating agency that admitted that they gave bogus credit ratings for money. But in any case, the people who were there at the time making the call, in most cases, they're gone by 2012, 13, 14. The shareholders, well, you had shareholders that shared in that profit from these criminal acts. Odds are they're not still holding the stock 5 years later. So I never understood the logic of pursuing that as a criminal matter against the company. Now, by all means, I would love to go after the individuals, the bank executives that said, hey, yeah, that's a really good idea. We don't have to follow the law. Let's go ahead and throw bad mortgages into mortgage-backed securities, or the credit rating agencies. Hey, we'll just give everyone AAA because they're paying us for that. Let's go after those people as individuals. I don't really understand the logic of going after the company.
Well, I have to say I certainly agree with you on that. I don't see the deterrent effect either, and I guess the flaw with my idea of at least going after individuals' compensation is that by the time the charges are settled, probably the culprits themselves are long gone and way down the road. But we certainly need to change the incentive system top to bottom. So thanks for bringing that to our attention.